And gentlemen, welcome to a new session of Room for Discussion. We're very honored with our special guest today. He's a prominent guest. He's a Dutchman, not only well known in this country, but all around the world. Usually in Room for Discussion, we aim for the politicians, the professors, the entrepreneurs, but we think it's good in this time of crisis to also have guests who have a more distant view on current events. Time magazine ranked him amongst the 100 most influential persons, so we can discuss a lot with him. We will talk about his profession as an architect, we will talk about the European project and the rise of China. There's room for your questions as well, after we're finished with the interview, and maybe in between as well. Give a warm applause to Mr. Rem Koolhaas.
Mr. Koolhaas, welcome. Again, a great honor for us to have you here at the University of Amsterdam. We're in front of an economic audience, mostly, I think. So maybe a good idea to familiarize the audience a bit with you and some of your work. You are, first of all, according to many experts, one of the leading architects at this moment. Your fame started with the publishing of the book Delirious New York in 1978, in which you declared your love to the city at a time when almost everyone had written it off. You also published other books, for example, SML XL, which is here on the table. You designed a lot of buildings for which you received the Pritzker Prize, sort of the Nobel Prize in architecture in 2000. And some of the buildings you designed we've put on the PowerPoint. I'll show some
Just
to
a couple.
To the
You can't
audience.
show them all.
For example, the public library in Shadow, which was finished in 2004.
Yeah.
Could you it see?
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
Other buildings, CCTV building in Beijing, which is still under construction, I think. We also have the Dutch embassy in Berlin, which was finished at the beginning of this decade. And another project still under construction is a building in Rotterdam, which is also called the Rotterdam. If you're looking at these buildings, is there a building that you like the most of them?
No. It's constant work in progress, and you don't kind of really have favorites, or at least I don't.
Okay, but still you're working on a lot of buildings, so I guess you have a very busy work schedule. How does a normal day in your life look like?
In a way, there are very few normal days. I'm either here, that means in the office. In the office, it's like a doctor. You basically see a number of kind of projects, and you spend maybe between 15 minutes and at the most 2 hours on trying to identify what is difficult, what doesn't work, etc., etc. But most, and the other half of my life I can really spend in travel. And in travel, it means kind of sometimes basically looking at the progress of buildings. And that means basically going on construction sites. And actually one of the really nice parts of the profession is that you have an intellectual dimension, but also almost an animal dimension, because you are very often in a single day, you know, in deep mud, or in very sophisticated kind of environments. So that's what I like.
Yeah, because I'm curious. The thing I think about while thinking of an architect is a drawing table. And I was very curious, how many hours do you spend behind a drawing table?
Actually 0.
Zero?
Yeah. But that now goes for all architects. We have no drawing tables anymore. And so they work, actually it's an interesting question, because most of architecture is designed on computers. Yeah. Even though I really believe that that is a kind of very limited way. So one way to work against those limitations, we work in models. And actually that is disappearing in most architecture. Most representation is now kind of renderings.
Renderings.
That try to be as realistic as possible. But we do communicate with drawings and with diagrams, drawn with ballpoint on paper.
Okay. So how can we still recognize a typical Rem Koolhaas building? What's the mark you leave behind? Is it?
Well, we work with, we have 300 people. We work with 7 partners, I think. And I don't think there is a kind of really typical way in which you would recognize things. I would say that, and I think very many architectural offices are kind of really organized in a kind of very hierarchical way. that there is a kind of top and then it trickles down and kind of people here have no influence. We have always prided ourselves on kind of being a very flat organization. It sometimes happens in the most poetic case that somebody walks off the street, comes into the office, and in 1 week already makes kind of significant contribution or could have a significant idea. So it is kind of really an environment where ideas are discussed, criticized, and then kind of emerge stronger. And I think maybe that is how you can identify our buildings, that there's ideas behind it.
Okay, so you have about around 300 people working for you. Are they all working here in an office in the Netherlands, or do you have more offices?
We have an office in Beijing with maybe 20 people, an office in Hong Kong with maybe 60 people, an office in New York with maybe 30 people.
Okay. While preparing for this interview, I read a lot about you, and I came across that you studied script writing. You were actually a script writer. And for me, that was a really strange discovery. You're an architect right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that script writing?
Yeah, so basically, I'm kind of really a child of the 60s. And although you must be kind of very bored by kind of people of my generation, and there are stories of how wonderful things used to be, there's kind of one thing that actually was very interesting in the 60s, which is that the kind of transparency of the society at that point. In other words, I was on the gymnasium. I failed my final examination. I wrote a letter to a Dutch weekly, the Haagse Post. Can I write for you? Yeah. I got a phone call the same day. Yes, you can kind of come. And then I could kind of clean waste baskets. But anyway, after a year I was kind of writing, and in the same way I had a kind of friend who was a filmmaker who asked me to write. So basically you didn't need to study anything, you didn't need to have any diplomas, and actually you could kind of really, in a way, take almost any initiative, and almost any initiative would be kind of embraced. And only when I was 25 did I kind of think about I have to maybe do something, and then I studied architecture.
Is that also part of the explanation of your success, the fact that you started with something completely different?
I don't know whether there's an explanation, but yeah, I think it makes a huge difference, because it meant that writing is very important, not only for me, but I think also in the history of the office, because we could actually describe the kind of architect and the kind of architecture we wanted to produce before we actually produced it. So through writing, I created a kind of space that I then occupied. And I think that was kind of unusual.
So just for the audience and for me as well, why did you become an architect from a scriptwriter, and not, for example, you have a broad view on society, you produce some manifestos. Why didn't you become a philosopher or a journalist, or why specifically an architect?
Well, I still think I'm a journalist. I think architecture is, first of all, it's very close to script writing, because in a script you have to kind of think of an event and then the next event, and kind of you create a connection, and hopefully through the sequence something happens, a story happens, or interest or humor happens. And in a way, architecture is very similar. You think of a space and an environment, and then almost by the same means of montage, you create a kind of sequence, and hopefully the sequence makes sense or is interesting. So in that sense, it's very similar. I think I became an architect because I went to the Soviet Union and saw work of the early architects working in Russia in the 20s, so-called constructivists. And they really looked like society, like a script, and kind of were really imagining how people could live. And did this in a kind of very libertarian, kind of exciting manner. For instance, emancipating not only women but also children. And so that became very inspiring, and that then kind of thought maybe it would be interesting to try to do the same in a kind of society which is, of course, less authoritarian and kind of much more complex.
Okay.
So you talked about the space of a building. If we now zoom out to the space of Europe, because if there's one thing I think that is keeping almost all of us busy these days, it's the economic situation in Europe. You were a scriptwriter. Is what is happening now something you could have thought of in a script?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I think that we all could see it happen, and I think that I actually have been involved in Europe. In 2001, we were kind of asked to somehow think of a more attractive way to kind of represent the idea of Europe. And I think it is true that kind of somehow the communication about Europe by the European Union is abysmal. And Europe is a kind of very complicated kind of situation where half the power is taken by an abstract group, half the power kind of remains in the individual countries, which means that the politicians in the individual country can blame the kind of abstract group in Brussels for everything which is wrong, even though they ought to support them. And so I think there's a kind of terrible kind of one-way situation where Europe is blamed and nobody defends it. And the defense of Europe itself is on such a introverted and inept level of communication that it's kind of really terrifying. So anyway, I was involved in that.
Yeah. We have an example. You worked for it, and you and AMO, which is like the conceptual think tank of your company, you made this flag for Europe.
The Greece part is on the right, I see.
Did you already thought of maybe Greece cutting it off so we can easily cut it off?
No, it was entirely, I mean, it was kind of basically, that was the moment that everyone was kind of really fearful that they would lose their identity. So it was kind of basically an attempt to start with Ireland, go with Greece, and show that there could be a larger whole, but that every kind of single component could be appreciated for its own kind of virtues and beauty. But of course, it basically went nowhere. I mean, everyone liked it, but Europe itself, the core, is unable to talk for itself. Yeah, or,
what do you define as the core of Europe?
Well, the EU. Yeah, no, let's say the EU as an institution. But then later, I was, and it was in the last 3 years, involved in group of so-called wise people that included Lech Walesa, Felipe González of Spain, but also Mario Monti, the new
Italian.
Yeah, Italian. Yeah. Thinking about Europe in 2030 and what it should do to become better adapted. And even at the very beginning, it was kind of incredibly evident that our attempts would be futile and that there would be this storm that was gathering speed, and that whatever we came up with would be kind of swept away by the kind of violence.
So you saw it coming?
Yeah,
What's happening right now?
We saw it coming. Yeah.
It's like, I read a nice comment, it's like a train crash in slow motion, the Euro crisis now, how it unfolds.
Well, I think it's more like you know, all these houses in Greece that are half finished. Yeah. You have the basement, but then you have the kind of reinforcement sticking out. And I think that's what Europe is. It's kind of unfinished. The base is there, but the reinforcement has never been completed. And either that happens or we can abandon it.
Was this flag one of your attempts to finish Europe?
Yeah, it was really to develop a language that was kind of slightly more appealing. You know, I mean, we're also, it's for instance kind of ridiculous that you have a mobile phone. You can receive messages. Kind of Europe could kind of communicate with every European kind of through messages. There is all kinds of much more appealing ways of making itself manifest, more modern ways, and it simply never happens.
Maybe it's nice to look in the audience and just ask how many of the Europeans here feel themselves European. If you feel yourself European, please raise your hand. We can make... Okay, that looks like the majority.
It looks like quite a lot, but how can we then explain that at least...
Well, it's kind of very interesting maybe to ask, if you don't raise your hand, what do you feel?
Somebody dares to speak.
Yeah. Because it's quite sad. So can somebody who didn't raise their hand kind of feel, do you simply feel Dutch or something else?
No. So maybe this is the new generation. And
do you have do you have your explanation for the fact that most of European citizens, at least at this moment, do not feel a true European identity?
I don't know that they don't. I think they do. I think that the whole issue of European identity is exaggerated. And I think that the best test is when you're not in Europe, you feel European. Yeah. And everyone is a European. And so in this group, I kind of represented kind of really, and this is typical for Europe. And in this group, there was not a single foreigner. Yeah, so, which was kind of really ridiculous, because if I would have to think about the future of Europe, I would kind of include an Indian or a Chinese kind of person or an African to come and be part of that. So I put it, sorry, I apologize, on myself to represent the kind of viewpoint from the outside.
Everybody is awake? Yeah, to get everybody awake?
Yeah.
That's good. So Europe,
Yeah, so I think that we are much too concerned about Europe, and I think that has been kind of really a wasted decade almost in the past 10 years. Kind of everyone was kind of worrying, are we European? Do we feel Europeans? Who are our neighbors? Do they feel Europeans? And too little consideration of the outside world that would have at least alerted them to a number of both potentials and kind of difficulties.
So your point is stop talking about it, just accept it, the fact that you're European.
Yes, it would be very smart, I think.
Yeah. Because if we look at this flag, we both found it a beautiful flag. It's a very unique experiment. But you can also say all these colors. That's the best evidence that there is no unity in Europe.
It's quite messy. You can also say it's. And that's what a lot of people feel right now, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that you can also say that maybe you should look at Renaissance. In the Renaissance, there were kind of regions, and there kind of were very kind of intelligent cities that were kind of organized at the scale of a city. And I think that kind of if you come to in Europe and travel in Europe, you kind of realize that there are kind of incredible intelligence in particular cities. If you look in the environment in Milan, for instance, it's kind of full of incredibly small, competent factories that can make anything that are kind of producing at the highest possible level, whether it's fashion, racing cars, computer stuff, display features for museums. It's incredible competence of making. If you look around Toulouse, there's an incredible competence of making airplanes. There's incredible. So I think that nations are, in a way, now a very ambiguous thing. They're not quite dead and no longer entirely alive. And I think that Europe should become kind of really a region, an entity of regions, kind of rather than these nearly dead entities that are our countries.
Well, obviously, it's now not going very well with Europe. To what extent do you think what's happening right now is damaging to the European dream, actually? Do you still have hope for the European continent to see the value of a united Europe?
And if they are able to fix it, it will be. If not...
And what are your predictions on that? If you look at the events taking place right now.
What are your predictions?
My predictions, I have my hope, and that's they will fix it. And now, because of this crisis, they will solve it, hopefully democratically. Yeah. But what I'm seeing right now is they try to fix it technically. And that's not working. You can see it. Every day you open the newspaper and you see another soap. So I think it's quite damaging what is happening right now. Yeah. And I don't know whether somebody is possible or is capable of...
Well, but on the other hand, I don't think we have the luxury for it to fail.
But somehow people don't realize that. That's what I see right now.
Yeah.
They all get back to their own national identity and focus on their own country, and they don't realize that we are living in a global world. And
yeah, but maybe we should all... I think there is kind of something kind of really absurd that we have become kind of so dependent on the market economy, not only in terms of the kind of vigor of our economy, but also as a kind of final arbiter of kind of whether we're doing well or not. And so I can also imagine that at some point we take the time to actually disregard it and kind of try to work it out, and in a way not let this kind of daily dose of panic dictate our behavior.
Yeah. Do you have any more?
Any questions from the audience
about Europe?
And that is kind of for me the really interesting kind of situation at this moment. There's this kind of whole world of the kind of banks teetering on the point of collapse.
Yeah.
There's this other world of Europe teetering on the point, but still the opinion of this group, which is more discredited than this group, kind of dictates the well-being of that group. So I find that a very weird paradox.
Yeah. If we look at your office, your own office, for example, is not the whole well-being of your office also dictated by the state of the economy? How do you look at that?
Yeah. Well, so yes, we're incredibly preoccupied with the economy, and simply because we felt it coming, we kind of reduced the scale of our office in 2008 in time, and therefore we actually didn't have a lot of problems. But also that is, of course, one of the beauties of the kind of work of an architect today. You can work in so many countries that kind of somehow it either balances out, or you can kind of focus on a few efforts that are that are really necessary.
Is the work group still in place? The European Commission think tank? Where
No. We basically there was a report. I mean, in the same way, we had a kind of very vigorous proposal to not only document our work, but also to document our proposals. We were proposing to do a graphic novel of Europe now, you know, and it was kind of very dramatic. It was inspired on a graphic novel on the kind of results of the commission that investigated the 9/11. I don't know whether you know it. It's kind of very smart, really funny, but also serious.
I've never heard it.
Yeah, so we proposed that for Europe, and again, there was no, it couldn't be kind of
no ground to.
Yeah, but I think that it would have been an enormous difference if every European got a kind of report and said, this is the situation, this is what you can achieve. So maybe, who knows?
Okay, let's zoom out from Europe to the world again. Am I correct that in 2001, in 9/11, OMA, your company, stood for the decision to participate in Ground Zero or CCTV building in China? And because the effects of 9/11, that's what I read, you thought that America was more intrinsic, more inward, a bit xenophobic. And that's why you took the decision to participate in China. If we take the parallel right now with Europe, do you think the Europeans are also getting more inward? And is that for you a reason to even shift your focus more to the East and to Asia? Is Asia becoming even more important in your attention and your focus of your company?
Well, it's not kind of really that we're kind of opportunistically kind of running after the kind of few pockets of affluence in the world. I'm a European. I'm kind of really committed to Europe. So it's not that we have the luxury, or I have the luxury to do the same thing, and I wouldn't want to. And it was not kind of really the introversion. I felt that America was, its values were turning. I could feel them turning even before 9/11. And for the time being, I think there is little we can expect from America in terms of some kind of global well-being or global intelligence. I think it's a country that is kind of struggling with its own kind of contradictions in a very sad way, in fact.
Which values do you have seen shifting exactly? Which
well, I mean, you've seen the kind of whole Bush years, and it's not only kind of politics, but it's also something very strange started to happen. And I think that's kind of partly true of Western society as a whole. And since I travel, you kind of sometimes hear new words or old words with a kind of unusual frequency. Yeah. And so in the early 90s in America, I heard the word comfortable. Yeah, comfortable, and it became more almost like an obsession, comfortable. So suddenly it alerted me to the fact that people felt afraid and kind of wanted to avoid kind of risk and were kind of more interested in comfort and adventure, or comfort and ambition, and that was kind of for me a first sign. And I think that you know, some of that is kind of happening here. The incredible obsession with security, all kinds of things that even in the 60s, 70s, or 80s were much less pronounced. So and that kind of really persisted, and that was then kind of also kind of reinforced by the politics. But even in a kind of university, I'm teaching in Harvard, I could kind of really notice, and it's kind of mostly intangible, but there was much less kind of opening to the world, much less vigor, and much more, you know, cocoon-like kind of condition.
Are you still doing some projects in the United States?
Yeah.
And how do you look at the future of that country, taking into account the shifting values there?
Well, of course, there's incredibly many incredibly smart people, and there are also kind of very powerful kind of centers for change, and so therefore it's kind of probably a struggle that could, you can almost not imagine America as a failed state. And so therefore I'm optimistic that the kind of forces that will avoid it kind of will ultimately win.
So during around 9/11, you went into the project of CCTV in Beijing. What were the main reasons for you to participate in a project like that in China?
Well, I think that since China is a country that will play a dominant role in this century, and is already playing a dominant role, I think we all have a stake in the outcome of what kind of world society China is becoming. And for that reason, I felt that it is significant to kind of participate, if you get an opportunity to participate, you know, in that outcome. And it's not that I have a kind of megalomaniac kind of opinion of our effects, but there is some effects, and I can maybe explain where I think the effects are.
Yeah, please.
So that was the reason, and also I knew China had kind of, and that is something we typically do. We go and look at the country kind of before we operate as architects. So I knew China, had been with students, had done a book on China, etc. So I felt that, you know, I knew enough to not act kind of foolishly. So we, in a way, took the most, let's say, Chinese of institutions, the media, the Central China television, so the television of the state, at a moment that those media are changing kind of very drastically. They're changing kind of and creating kind of multiple channels. They went kind of from 2 to I think already now 25, and kind of in 2 years it will be kind of in the hundreds. They have kind of international kind of stations now in England, in Africa, so they are competing kind of with CNN, Al Jazeera, and so I think that if you look at the media landscape, we are in a kind of very interesting kind of world. We have CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera in China, and so each of them is also kind of very connected to each other, and basically it's also clear that they cannot tell outright lies, yeah, because somehow through this communication there inherently has to be a kind of raising of the level. So that is why we participated. It was very controversial, as you can probably know. And one of my best friends kind of wrote that it was a scandal that kind of Europeans participate in that kind of thing, and that it would be okay if we would participate with a hospital or with housing, but not okay with this. And my position is that actually, if you want to participate, it's better to do it with kind of significant things rather than harmless or innocent things.
So the goal you set for yourself before participating in the project, you think they are realized to some extent? Like the media has become more open?
It's constant kind of up and down. But there is an evolution in a particular direction that is sometimes stopped, sometimes goes. And for instance, kind of very ironically, kind of the fact that we did 2 buildings that are kind of related to each other. One of them, as you reminded me, went up in flames. The fact that it went up in flames in itself had an effect on kind of media in China, because for the first time, kind of CCTV, which was a kind of colossus that didn't communicate to the public, apologized. So that was kind of really considered and had to give an opening of what had actually happened there. So I think that over time, there is a kind of particular direction that will work out.
You see this building as a contribution to that, to the media in China becoming more open?
Well, yes, it's partly a contribution to that, but also kind of on a technical level. For instance, a kind of building that could not have been built without the computers that are in that we have at our disposal in the last 10 years, simply in terms of analyzing the behavior and the kind of the possible failure of each element. And so therefore, we needed to negotiate it with kind of 150 professors of statics in China, and that became then also a kind of form of dialogue. And therefore, I am confident, and in China it's also kind of acknowledged that therefore we were able to modernize the way China thinks about structure. Now, you don't think that's kind of important, maybe, but I think that is, yeah, it's partly an economic issue, but it's also, of course, an issue, you know, how a culture evolves.
Yeah. Just a more technical question. If we look at this building, what then makes it so difficult to build? What makes the construction so
It's not so much that it's so difficult to build, but it's incredibly difficult to be precise about static behavior. Beijing is an earthquake zone. So basically, if you look at kind of only with the kind of computers we have now, can we kind of really analyze every single member, you know, including the window frames, in terms of how it will behave according to certain earthquake strength, and so how the entire building kind of survives.
Just my own question, the lines you see on the building,
yeah.
What do they reflect? What's their message?
Yeah, so basically there's no message, but I can kind of point out basically this is a kind of regular grid. And with these computers, we could see, and you can almost understand it, that kind of certain points were kind of would have a tendency to buckle, you know, or to bend. And so basically, kind of rather than put more steel in, we doubled it. And when they didn't have to work kind of particularly hard, we eliminated it. So actually, it's a kind of very precise structural diagram, but it looks kind of artistic.
So they're not for decoration, but they have a real function.
No, they're totally not for decoration.
Okay.
But of course, and this is, you know, this is the whole point of architecture, that you try to make things work on many levels, and of course it's also an aesthetic effect that in my view kind of works well with Chinese aesthetics.
Okay. And as you said, you traveled all around the world. You've been in many cities, many places. If you walk the streets of Beijing, what do you take notice of? You've been in so many places. If you look around to the people, the way they walk, the way they talk, the way they act, what's the first thing that inspires you and that captures your notice or your attention? It's maybe a very open question. But
yeah, but it's of course also kind of beautiful question. What is most noticeable in Beijing is that kind of basically first of all, it's changing so fast that every time you try to record differences, and there are differences almost kind of every month. There's differences in mood. It's kind of expansive, or it can be kind of anxious, or it can be the influence of politics is incredible. So basically, right now, everyone is anticipating the change of government. It will happen next year. The outcome, will have a kind of big effect. So you can sense that people are holding their breath. But what I think is the most what I notice best in the street is and it's kind of in a way an Asian kind of situation, or an Asian body language, kind of really. We are typically very forceful and we behave as if we kind of own the territory, and we are can sometimes be quite crude physically. For instance, if you're in a Dutch swimming pool, the kind of preferred way of entering of the Dutch is kind of jump in the water. Yeah, and kind of there's kind of something much more elegant and smooth and kind of less based on kind of resistance in the kind of Asian language. So you feel an incredible ingenuity, but also an incredible discretion in terms of expressing or claiming space for themselves, which is kind of probably a kind of partly a precaution, but also partly a part of the culture.
So it's some sort of discipline as well on the streets.
The Chinese are not so disciplined.
Are not so disciplined?
No.
Okay. We have a question from the audience, I see.
Yeah.
Since we're the faculty for business and economics, I was wondering, what can business learn from architecture, and specifically on beauty, creativity, and personal brands? Personal brands. Because architects, they need to brand themselves as a person.
Branding. Okay, let me start with the last. I think that branding is a kind of really one of the most stupid concepts in the history of mankind. And actually I'm kind of really happy that there is to a certain extent an American decline, and I hope that will also kind of contribute to the decline of the whole notion of branding, because branding is kind of reducing things to essence, and I think that if you reduce things to essence, it's not kind of really a kind of very productive way to operate in the kind of current complexity. Beauty, I'm kind of probably a bad teacher of beauty because I find that we almost never deal with it openly or directly, and it's we also kind of Dutch and slightly neurotic about it, about admitting our interest in it. So we can only achieve it if we are intellectually convinced. I don't know whether that is true, whether you have to be, probably in economy also you have to find a kind of beautiful formula, and then maybe you generate beauty. Elegance. Elegance. So maybe that is the essence. What was the first in you?
Creativity was the last
one. Creativity in the economy. We generate our creativity not because we are so creative or are so artistic or have so much to say, but it's kind of really, speaking for myself, completely an issue of engagement with the world. Yeah? So I'm unbelievably curious, and so therefore I have the kind of luxury of encountering an incredible vast amount of different conditions, and to somehow make sense and work with those conditions is something that kind of provokes my creativity, and I think that must be very much similar for economists. So I would say, find a way to leave the room and to go out into the world and to kind of somehow connect previously unconnected points or givens or tendencies.
I think that answers your question.
One more question on
that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, curiosity is really important, but do you really look for something like, okay, I feel like I now need to do archery because that's going to teach me something? Or is it just, hey, I want to do archery just for the heck of it? How do you get your inspiration?
Well, it's partly based on, let me give you kind of an example. So basically, kind of for a long time, for a long time, when I started my career, there was a kind of very conventional kind of way of thinking about the city. And basically it was in architectural terms and kind of trying to control the city. A beautiful city or good city was a city that was designed. In the meantime, it became clear that kind of cities needed to be kind of produced at such incredible speed that they could no longer be held together by architectural vision. So architects kind of went into moaning mode, kind of said everything is bad, because the city that we can do cannot be produced anymore. So I tried to think and ask the question, why is this city generated? And kind of instead of moaning, are there perhaps kind of particular virtues about it? And I really felt that it was kind of part of a worldwide resistance to the kind of control that actually the kind of more shapeless city that had kind of more fluidity were actually corresponding to some extent also to something that people wanted. So I tried to readjust the kind of expectation that you could have of cities and for cities. So you can see that as a kind of creativity or creative engagement with the city, but it was kind of basically a way of following kind of both intuition but also kind of thinking about it. So I think it's very, for me, creativity is almost the same thing as analyzing a kind of situation. And I think that intimate connection between the two are really, and it can be kind of really very simple. So everyone became interested in the city. There is also kind of very well-known graph that we are now over 50% of mankind lives in cities. So now the focus is on cities. Then I became a little bit bored with it and kind of was wondering, okay, so what did they leave behind? And now we're looking at what they leave behind, and so now we're interested in the countryside. It is a form of creativity, but it's not necessarily based on talent or on uniqueness. It's kind of simply on closely following and being alert to small and big tendencies.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
You're talking about the countryside. Is that then more for the advanced economies, or does it also hold for China, for example?
It holds really for all of them. Yeah.
For all of them.
I think we have a good question about Baiwei. Maybe you can introduce it.
Yeah, of course, there's criticism on human rights in China. We talked about CCTV building and your opinion about it. There's also cultural criticism, and not only from outside, but also from within. Famous artist Ai Weiwei. Maybe you've met him before, or
yeah, I met him.
You know him. He painted this beautiful 5,000-year-old Neolithic Chinese vase. He painted it with the Coca-Cola logo, and that is his way to express his concern about the demolishing of Chinese culture because of the economic boom that is taking place there now. How is your opinion about that? Because in a way you're also contributing to it by your building.
To demolishing
well, I would
Chinese
not say
culture?
demolishing, but in general, Chinese culture is suffering.
Modernization, of course. Yeah, but so we have our own way of kind of responding to that. Again, in a way for the same reason, and also kind of in the same explanation. Of course, the question whether the contribution the architect makes to modernization is positive or not is a very preoccupying kind of question. Yeah. and I think that I can say we're kind of very self-critical. So what we try to do, and that is actually why we started our other branch, AMO, because at some point, it was maybe in the kind of late 80s, I kind of realized that architecture is a kind of absurd profession, because the only thing it can do is change things. Yeah, the only thing somebody goes to the architect, it's always to get rid of this, do that, or there's nothing here, put something. So I really felt that absolutely crazy. So I felt the need to kind of restructure the office for two reasons: that we could find another way and another kind of form of response, but also that we could ourselves be more in charge of the agenda and develop things independently of clients. Because otherwise you sit, you wait, and you do. or you don't. So that enabled us to a certain amount of independence, and with that independence, we looked for territories, critical territories to inform and make our office smarter, but also to extend the range of what we do. So exactly because I did not only want to kind of participate in modernization, I also became interested in preservation 10 years ago. And kind of, for instance, kind of right now we're working on a master plan for the Hermitage Museum in Petersburg. And there, as an experiment, I am dedicated to not making a single change, not making a single architectural contribution, but simply looking partly curatorially and partly kind of in terms of how the kind of their buildings are organized, in adapting it and making it more adequate for the current moment and current expectation. So there we don't change anything, and we are actually engaged in keeping it, but making it kind of somehow more useful.
But you're then becoming sort of an interior architect.
No, it's not even an interior architect. Even interior, we're not changing anything, but it's what we're doing is kind of right now. If you, I don't know whether you've been there, but it's a complex of 5 different buildings. Basically, there is a kind of single flow, very dense of people that are chased through the entire building. Complex, and you don't realize that one part once was a palace, the second part was once a private art gallery, the third part was a public museum. And so what we're trying to do is to reintroduce the past in a kind of more visible moment, so that you're not only looking at paintings, but you're also aware that in this room such and such an event took place.
And did AMA also came up with some recommendations for the Chinese in the way they handle their cultural heritage? And how they
yeah, exactly. We are working on the introduction on a number of experiments on preservation in China.
Okay. And I consider you as some sort of China expert. I've never been there. For me, it's a very abstract concept. The Chinese boom.
Can I see how many people? How many of you have been in China?
Wow, that's
pretty
quite
good.
a lot.
Because one of the things we offered in this kind of European project the last time, we studied how many Chinese study abroad. We were interested to discover that half of the Chinese students abroad go to America, but the other half actually go to Europe. So
yeah, here we have a lot of Chinese students as well.
Yeah, but I think that we are unbelievably uncreative in terms of what we do with those students, because I consider students as experts. They're at least experts on their own countries, and I think you're probably not doing anything to actually kind of recognize that aspect here.
No, in the sense that I talk with my Chinese fellow students.
Yeah, or you could organize the next time, kind of suggest you invite a kind of representative and you talk about China with them, and they'll probably surprise you with what they know about their own country. But we also looked at European students to America, internationally. The vast majority go to America. Then the next destination for European students, of all places, is Australia. And then a minuscule fraction goes to China. And I think that is where, regardless of identity, regardless of the political situation in Europe, regardless of anything you can use as an alibi, I think that's an outrageous lack of curiosity and outrageous lack of ambition in individual young Europeans.
Yeah. So, because you sense now with the European crisis, we have the stability fund.
So I think it's nothing to do with the crisis. It's just a lack of initiative.
Yeah.
A total lack of initiative and a total lack of vision. What if you want to kind of lead an interesting life, what you ought to do, how to prepare yourself.
So if you had one advice to this audience here, for the people who have not been in China, is go there. discover it,
not only go
take
there,
initiative.
but also study there. Learn Chinese, go there, and
It's quite hard.
Learn Chinese.
Well, who says it's quite hard?
And that's what I always hear. But
Yeah.
it's a lot of science, like 5,000 or even more.
No, but you have to. You don't have to read it. You can talk it.
Yeah, that's good. So you.
No.
That's a good question. Are you learning it?
I'm trying it. I basically speak Indonesian, so I have one Asian language, but that's
Because you grew up there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say because we don't know it, we're scared of it in a way, and we shouldn't be scared of it. We should just be curious.
You should engage it.
But you say Chinese people are taking the lead, are taking the initiative, in contrary to those in Europe. Is this also the role of China in the world economy?
I'm not comparing you to the Chinese. I'm kind of just saying that it is. There is no excuse for it. Kind of not politics, not the situation of Europe, not the economy, because there's ample opportunities.
I have one question out of my own personal interest. I was preparing for this interview, and Saturday I watched a documentary about ghost cities in China. And you say you also look at the countryside and what they leave behind. And that claim that there are like cities of 12 million people, a lot of buildings, and people don't live in it. Like 60% is not being occupied. And they claim that they just built those buildings to boost their growth. Do you think the growth is sustainable in China? For me, it came really like, yeah, they're growing, but are they growing sustainable? It's not.
Well, there is some of that, I went to the Pearl River Delta in '94, and I saw the same thing, and I raised the same question and asked myself the same question, and I think it's kind of just different. I mean, what happens in China is, if we discover kind of, for instance, a problem in traffic, and we hesitate, kind of we wring our hands, we debate, and then we grudgingly kind of fix it in a way which is so submitted to political compromise that the solution is only half the solution. And so for us, infrastructure is a kind of remedy. Their infrastructure is a kind of prediction that actually announces a future intention and a kind of future environment. And so everywhere in the Pearl River Delta where I questioned whether it was either necessary or plausible or kind of sustainable, 10 years later it is kind of completely used, deeply kind of part of a kind of incredibly kind of busy and intense system. So
people are more or less instrumental then to Chinese growth, but is that a sustainable situation? In the end, it's about the people, not about the economy.
Yeah, I think it is. What I've seen is that yes, after a while, those kind of things are necessary and are inhabited, and are used and become part of everyday life. Whether it is sustainable, I think, is kind of intimately connected to our own kind of situation. I mean, of course, we started to raise the sustainability issue when we were done with our kind of modernization, and when we all had our cars and we, etc., etc. And what I actually see is that China is taking kind of more serious measures than we are.
In terms of sustainability?
In terms of sustainability.
And you've seen that in like
I mean, you see it everywhere, and you see it in kind of in entire regions that are kind of turned in solar and wind kind of farms. And
okay.
But I don't want to idealize. China is not a kind of utopia, far from it. Just as we are not a utopia, also far from it. But I'm not pro-China in that sense. I'm just involved with the issue of China and with the issue of the outcome.
If there's another growing economy like China, is for example India, are you also involved right there? Or is there a reason that you're more focused towards China? Is there a difference in energy maybe, or what is it?
Yeah, a difference in energy.
Do you have any projects in China? In India? No. And why is that? Because it's one of the growing, I've been there myself.
Yeah.
It's a crazy country, but there's a lot of energy going on there. So maybe, as an architect, I would like
Well, I mean, it's got partly also because you cannot kind of, I need some focus. And the engagement is kind of pretty intense. It's kind of pretty intense to run an office and then kind of to also go to India. So, so that's what I was saying. We're not opportunistically going to anywhere where there's kind of growth.
How many times a year do you travel to China?
For the past, let's say 10 years, I've been there maybe once every 6 weeks.
Once every 6 weeks. And are you doing any other projects in China?
Yes. We're doing one kind of building which is intimately connected to the economy, the stock market in Shenzhen.
The stock market?
Yeah.
Are there any questions about China? Yeah,
go to the microphone, please. Nog 5 minuten.
Yes. I notice you have a very deep motivation behind the projects you do, and that you sort of step away from the idea of opportunistically approaching a project. In participating in the CCTV project, you just explained your motivation in playing a role in the development of China. Were you welcomed for this motivation? Did they welcome your motivation as wanting to play a role?
That's kind of really a very good question, of course, because you can only have an effect if that effect is welcomed. The term welcoming I would not use. Yeah. So yes, there was a kind of eagerness, of course, to share the building of to share the idea of a modern building as their next home. But a lot of things were actually quite arduous negotiation and quite. And sometimes quite frustrating kind of non-events. But there again, at the same level, there is a kind of general interest. For instance, now, and that is a kind of very recent change. I think that China made the decision that the economy and money alone are not making everybody happy. That there is kind of no immediate outcome that the country can become democratic, so that some other aim has to be kind of defined. And I think that for the moment they define that aim as culture. So culture is becoming a very significant part, partly domestic Chinese culture. That probably means, you know, rehabilitation of some traditional culture, but also a real engagement on the cultural level with other countries. And so you have to improvise constantly. So if it doesn't work on one level, it sometimes works on this level and then on that level. But it's quite arduous, not easy, and you have to keep pushing.
Okay, yeah. So you really were motivated to change, to sort of set the standard for going on in China, to either change intention?
I mean, but on a modest way. But I mean, I try to expose myself also to I mean, you think that, and maybe that's actually interesting. So here, people are very skeptical against doing it. In China, also, people are very skeptical. I went to Tsinghua University, for instance, to have a meeting kind of alone with 400 of my critics. And that was unbelievably interesting, because Chinese are completely articulate, absolutely unreserved in terms of criticizing people, very, very vocal and precise. But even that I consider a very useful and productive exchange. So they said everything, I could say everything back. And so there are kind of young people who think it's a waste of money. There's old people who think it is an outrage to manipulate the laws of structure in that way. So there are many different positions, but you know, through confronting them, you can also deal with part of them.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? Right there. Please go to the microphone.
Try to keep it short, because we're...
You've been introduced as standing on the list of most influential people on Time magazine as one of the only designers. What should design business do to become more influential in the world?
Well, basically, I hate those lists because I mean it obviously is kind of totally meaningless, and kind of basically they do it every year. Yeah. So and basically once you're in that list, it kind of is constantly recirculated, but it's.
It was a good promotion tool for us.
Yeah. No, it's kind of very good for
branding.
for you. Yeah, for branding. But to regain initiative for design, are you a designer? Is that what you're asking?
I'm an urban planner.
You're
An urban planner.
urban planner, and you want to become more powerful.
I'm curious what the role of designers will be in the future, in comparison to
to
contemporary.
what it is now. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it's very difficult for me to say to some extent because I very reluctant to think that our model, because whether it's explicit or implicit, we have a model, really should be the model, or whether we actually benefit from being the only people with this model. In other words, whether it should be kind of a general state, or whether, and therefore could be a prototype, or whether it depends for its success on not being the prototype, but being the unique kind of situation. But particularly for urban designers, I really find it very, very difficult to give you a kind of good kind of recommendation. Because I find it very difficult here, because the process is so incredibly complex. And it's kind of really difficult on which side with which side you should align yourself. Because I think that particularly urban design is kind of really falling in the gap between the kind of public and the private sector. The public sector no longer being able to, no longer with the means, and the private sector not having the vision. Yeah, so it's and the money. Yeah, so it's a kind of really sandwiched. So if you're sandwiched, it's kind of probably better to align yourself with other disciplines and to try to form a kind of smarter entity than simply kind of urban design.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question.
We have other
Any more questions?
Oh, we should lower the mic.
Okay. Hi, I'm from China, and I really like your design. But my question is, you've been to Beijing, you know, the Forbidden City and the ancient architecture for thousands of years. And in Beijing, there are also many new modern architectures. But some people argue that it is totally different from the ancient Beijing style. So you look at one side is the Forbidden City and the Red Wall, typical wall. And look at the other side is the very modern architecture. But putting together, it may be a little bit contradictory. So it's not exactly fit to each other. So how do you think of this problem?
It's very true, but that used to be the essence of the city. And that is also the beauty of the city. The city is kind of not a harmonious complex, but the city is a way in which different entities, different people, different entities, different classes, different religions, the city is about difference more than about homogeneity. And,
but if you look at Europe, now for example, Amsterdam, most of the architectures are old, from the very old time, last for maybe hundreds of years. But China now more Asian architectures are just torn down.
It's true, and so Amsterdam was lucky because it maybe in something like 200 years it was able to define a center, and the center is not very big. So what the difference is that
China is too
that
big?
they took time, and that they had time, and I think the difficulty, the unique difficulty that China is facing is that the numbers are so enormous that it has to produce enormous amounts of new substance. whether we do it or somebody else do it or the Chinese do it. And so there has never been so much kind of urban substance generated in such a kind of incredibly short time. And that is a unique historical situation for China, and that is China facing. That is, of course, creating a lot of tension and a lot of disharmony. And I agree with you that sometimes the results are shocking or very brutal. Yeah. And that therefore it's not always kind of wonderful for the inhabitants. But it is a further argument on my side for the West to make the most sincere effort to introduce their intelligence and to try to make out of that shock the best possible shock. And for instance, in our particular building, I think that I don't know whether you've seen it, but one of the qualities is that it is kind of never the same from any different angle, and that kind of sometimes it looks strong and sometimes it looks weak, and we have made it deliberately so that it has a kind of easiness to go with almost every situation in Beijing. I have kind of some very beautiful pictures taken from hutongs with the building where the two actually go very well together.
So have you thought about making your future architecture more linked to the Chinese style or a fusion of the different styles?
Yeah, it's not quite a fusion, but we actually take it very seriously, and we try to not do something Western. Yeah, so I cannot say it's Chinese, but we try to do not something kind of which is Western in the classical way. And there's also something that I think kind of people should kind of realize, that when you talk about the kind of 300 people in our office, we are actually kind of mini UNs. Yeah? The architectural office is totally globalized, and each architectural office has now, we have people from China, from Pakistan, from really completely global. So the nature of the architectural office is also changing. For instance, when we worked on CCTV, we worked with 50% of our people were Chinese. So there's also contribution already in the design through Chinese people.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. We're exceeding the time limit a bit. We're over the 60 minutes. Is that a problem for you?
No.
Maybe you need to catch a plane. If you don't, maybe...
No, I have 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Well, then we have room for another question.
Yes, very quickly. I would like to have your very critical opinion about the contemporary architectural canon, because I see that
the contemporary architecture
style, let's say style.
Here now.
Yes, now, because we see that we look at the past very often and we look at mistakes. We say that the modernist social housing blocks in time were a mistake, that the large-scale events like the Expo in many cities became a mistake. The central business districts were mistakes. So, I would like to know, in 50 years, we might look at your architecture and the contemporary architecture, we might say this was a mistake. I mean, I know it might be a logical game, but what do you think will be the mistake of today architecture in 50 years?
Actually, I think it's a very, very interesting question. And part of my career I spent in creating amnesty for all those mistakes. In other words, I think we are creating a kind of crazy situation where we can never be satisfied with what we've done or what our predecessors have done. There's a kind of very fantastic example in Amsterdam. I don't know whether you know it, a housing neighborhood, the Bijlmermeer, which consisted of kind of huge slabs of kind of 11 stories. The moment it was finished, and it was finished as a kind of utopia of kind of social housing, the moment it was finished, the very socialist people responsible for it started to denigrate it. So it's inhumane, it's terrible, we have to change it, then an airplane crashed in it, and then it became the kind of easy to actually change it. So now we are in a desperate situation because it's a mistake. You cannot see its virtues anymore because we have changed it. And every kind of form to compensate for the mistake is also a mistake. So it's becoming a cluster of mistakes. So I've been very aggressive to say, actually you should keep it intact, and it represents an ideal of a particular moment. And I think that mankind is sufficiently flexible to live in some of those ideals. And actually, in the context of preservation, it's a very important thing, because right now, exactly because we consider all those things mistakes, in Italy, in Russia, everywhere, there is on the one hand an incredible obsession with preservation, but on the other hand, an incredible aggression against everything we did in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, which is on its way to be kind of destroyed. So I think that one of the actions should be an argument that to discover or rediscover the virtues of all those elements, and to rediscover their integrity, because actually, if you really look well, there is very often a kind of integrity.
What's the weaknesses of today's architecture?
Well, I think the weakness of today's architecture is kind of simply, it's very clear, effect. Yeah? An incredible attempt to create uniqueness and extravagance. That's a weakness.
Thank you for a good question.
Okay.
Sadly, we have come to an end, but of course we have a final question. I know for a fact you're a swimmer, and during this conversation I noticed you like to swim against the current. Against what current can we see Rem Koolhaas swimming in the next years? What's the current you see now and where you want to swim in against? What's the new...
Well, I think that for me, it's not so much swimming against the current. I think that kind of suggests a heroism, which is not really the motivation at all, because I'm sometimes swimming with the current in a way which is kind of maybe a little bit early, and therefore people think it's against the current. But
okay, so what early current are you swimming with?
I would say the early current that we're kind of really seriously thinking about is really the countryside. What could be the countryside? You know, it's completely ignored. We don't look at it anymore. We don't know what happens there. We don't inhabit it. So that's a kind of major effort.
Okay.
I would also say that we are very interested. We have a think tank. We're very interested in the economy. So if you want a career,
they don't want that. They don't want that.
Also consider that we would be interested in kind of smart people kind of working on that level.
Yeah, interesting. And Amo, that's your thing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the interview, Mr. Koolhaas. Also on behalf of the audience, I think. Just a few practical remarks closing. You can find more about our concept, Room for Discussion, on our website, www.roomfordiscussion.com. For the next weeks, we have also some nice sessions coming up. 29th of November with a board member of Ahold, a supermarket chain. 2 days later, we have a panel discussion in the evening with Ewald Engelen and Paul Tang, I think, a bit more economists. So lots of interesting things coming up also for us. But now, thank you, Mr. Koolhaas.
Give a warm applause, please.
Give him a warm applause.